Back to these things. The second disc, which actually was my first ever, sorry I should have kept them in chronological order for you, had a crew of 5. Only 2 were alive. The strange thing is, we had no idea what killed the other 3. There was only some bruising on their bodies from what we assume was the hard landing, but nothing serious. By the way, the typical gray alien description that people give is pretty close to on the money. Not quite, but very close. They're a little taller than people think, and the eyes aren't quite as big as people draw, but they are big, which tells us they grew up in a low-light environment. All their ships were dimly lit on the inside. I don't know why people who claim to be abducted talk about brightly lit rooms. We never saw any of that. It was dim enough inside these ships to see, but it wasn't comfortable. Maybe these people who say they were abducted are just remembering things wrong. One thing we figured out quickly is they can mess with your head, mess with the way you perceive things. Anyway, the 2 live ones. They weren't injured or anything, just kind of stared at us once the ship opened. The program has strict protocols because we're always expecting to make contact with non-human intelligence, and there are very strict protocols on what to do and what not to do. People think we go after these craft gun blazing in full military gear. I mean, yeah, when I did security for the program, we were heavily armed. We never knew what we were up against or if a foreign team would show up. That happened once or twice. But the security people are on the outside, well away from the craft. Think about it. These things are smart enough to cross the galaxy or come from wherever they come from. Do you really want to show up and send soldiers first? No. We first take readings to ensure there's nothing toxic or hazardous. Then we send in medical personnel. The lead doc we call the ambassador. He had special training for contact protocols in case we ran into something living and talking. The ambassador always spoke at least English, Russian, Chinese, and Spanish, the most prevalent human languages, and I think also things like American Sign Language, though just to be aware of how to speak with body gestures. Not that we expected them to know ASL. So we kept the guys with the guns well back, out of sight if we could. It was a risk. Maybe these things would shoot up the medical team, or maybe there's a space monster in there. But it was a better risk than starting an interstellar war or scaring the hell out of them with armed grunts. That night, the 2 live ones apparently just kind of stood there as the team entered the craft. It had opened on its own. Maybe they opened the door. I don't know if it was open when we got there. They stood there and they didn't answer the ambassador at all. Basically, they just barely reacted to anything. Just basic stimuli like turning their heads away from bright lights. They didn't even object when the medical team started looking them over for injuries, or so I was told. I saw them when they were led out of the craft, and I do mean they were led out like children. The medical guys grabbed them by the hand and just let them out like a kid. They just sort of stood where you left them. I was on Overwatch Squad. We'd spread out along the entrance in a U formation and kept in the tree line, again to provide security if they did anything, but not be visible and intimidating. It was a rule that you never leveled your rifle at these things, even if they were corpses or looked like corpses. Just because they appear dead doesn't mean they are. We don't know much about their physiology, you know. So the last thing you want is for them to feel threatened. I never once leveled my rifle at them or their bodies in all my years on the security side. You always kept the weapon at low ready, muzzle pointed to the ground. People got the wrong idea, and they think we're out there snatching these things up and whisking them away for dissection. Let me tell you, we did everything possible to be helpful. We tried to provide medical treatment, but these things always died. Always. They'd live at most another few days, never said a word or reacting to anything, and then they just slump over. Eventually we figured out that they can take in water based on what we found in the ship, and apparently the food, or whatever you call it, was pretty basic protein and other stuff, I don't know, but nothing fancy. So when we figured it out, we started hooking the live ones up to IVs when we could. They have a circulatory system like us. We figured that out from the corpses, but no matter how hard we tried to keep them alive, they always just keeled over eventually. Back to that night though, the things just stood around wherever we guided them. You led one to stand over there and it'd stand there. You move it somewhere else and it stands there. Their limbs are a little long and their knees aren't in the right places, but they would sit on chairs if one was available. Otherwise, they just stand there until they fell over, exhausted. That and the way their organs worked led us to believe that these things are, well, they're basically just drones, like biological computers. Whatever's making these things just creates a biological crew when it needs one, and they do their job and nothing else. At least that was our theory, because their bodies didn't seem built to last, and the eggheads found it suspicious that they were able to breathe our atmosphere so easily. What are the odds that space aliens would also be able to breathe our exact atmosphere? Plus, we never found anything we'd call personal items on the interiors, ever. There were no drawers full of spare clothing, nothing that looked like it was for entertainment, not even a sleeping area. I don't know if they had to go to the bathroom. Again, a lot of information was compartmentalized, but when I moved to the administrative side of things, you can't stop people from talking. And in truth, the program wanted us to talk, at least those of us who were seniors, because it provided an outlet. You sit on something like this, and you have no one to talk to about it or ponder what this whole thing is, and it eats you up inside. They found that out the hard way in the early days, so they relaxed about how compartmentalized everything was once you'd achieved senior status. Plus, I think they wanted us to share ideas. It's a giant mystery, and people need to share ideas to figure it out. So these things, the aliens, I guess, are probably just biological computers, basically. That's what we thought. But who knows, maybe they're so alien we just don't understand anything about them. But everything seemed to point to that conclusion. And that was suspicious too, because we recovered craft with no crew. So why did the saucers and one or two other types need a crew? We had a theory. Again, I've been out of it for over 20 years, so maybe they know stuff now we didn't back then. But we had a theory in my time that this was all being fabricated for us. We actually tasked NASA to look for where something like a big 3D printer could be in the solar system. Some facility or computer just making these crafts and these things and sending them to Earth. And sometimes they crashed or they just landed and didn't take off. Like whatever was doing this wanted us to recover the craft. I don't know if they ever found anything, though there was some excitement for a while. It's hard to hide heat in space, and obviously making these crafts on such a large scale would give off a lot of heat. Or maybe not. Maybe they use physics we don't even understand. I never felt that these things were a threat. The security teams were really more to keep other people out for whatever was in the craft, but I know that sometimes they defended themselves. The Iranians tried to shoot one down, and it didn't go well for them. We tried too, but it didn't go well for us either. I think we got a little better at it, and I know we did down one or two in the 90s, but only because there was a legitimate concern over what they were doing. They hurt people sometimes. I don't know if it was on purpose or not. I think it was just a side effect of their presence. But there was a lot of good intelligence that you really don't want to be near one when its power systems are fully online. I said earlier that they can mess with your head, and I don't think that's on purpose either. We were confident that the source of the trouble wasn't the living beings we recovered, because you'd get the same effect when the craft was empty if you got close. Not all the time, but sometimes. People would describe things happening in different ways. Never big, major differences, but enough to be worrying. We had to develop special techniques for handling exposure to these crafts. We called them anchors, a consensus on what is reality. For instance, if you and I were on a security team and approached a craft, we'd say, okay, the craft is resting up against a big oak tree, and there's a gray boulder on the other side. You'd think of that picture, and it would help with the confusion whenever that effect happened. Kind of ward it off. I don't know what it was though. Maybe a side effect of the technology, maybe some attempt at communication. It didn't seem a defensive measure to me, but yeah, I'm not surprised when there's a sighting and people see different things. As a matter of fact, I know there have been some high-profile events where people have suffered from this phenomenon. The Hopkinsville Goblins, for instance. Those people were shooting at ghosts, but really there was a craft in the vicinity. It's way back when we were first figuring things out though. As far as what they want, I can't tell you. If anyone figured it out, they didn't share it with me. I don't think they're a threat. We only recently got the tech to even harm these things, and even then it seems more like they're letting us do it. We strongly suspected this whole phenomenon was a form of gifting. Why else would craft crash or just land and then nothing comes to try to recover it? If we had a space mission go bad on Mars, we'd send help if we could. I guess Mars is too far away, but okay, the moon. We could rescue people on the moon if we needed to, and we would, but nobody ever comes for these things. And why are they sometimes landing completely operational and not taking off again? Most of us thought that it was a way of gifting technology without massive disruption to our own evolution. I don't know how much they figured out, and I wonder if they ever managed to even fly one of those things. I do know that from speaking to the eggheads, this technology is so far advanced they couldn't tell the difference between the toilet and the drive system. It'd be like giving a nuclear aircraft carrier to the ancient Romans. Maybe they figured it out by now. I don't know. I don't think so. Or we would see some tremendous technology by now. We had another conclusion though, this one more disturbing. Maybe they just left these crafts lying around because they were easy to build, and they just didn't care because they had a plan to deal with us well before we figured out their technology. Imagine if we accidentally lost an F-14 Tomcat to the ancient Romans, fully intact. while doing reconnaissance. What would we care if they studied it? By the time they figured out how to even turn the damn thing on, we'd already have dealt with them. So maybe we're getting gifted, or perhaps we're getting to be dealt with before we're a problem. I don't know. Only time will tell.